Alright, so what we've clearly seen from the articles we've gathered on this site are there's a lot of different ways to look at the Tunisian Revolution. And there's a lot of different yardsticks for measuring whether it was a success or a failure. You've got quite a few different ways of looking at this. You've got the Saudi Islamists who were saying the Tunisian Revolution was successful in removing a corrupt government, but it needs to go further by making the country Islamist. You've got Chomiak who's saying the Tunisian Revolution is an absolute success because it's opened up the public sphere and opened up freedom of expression within the country. You've got the article from the Mer News Agency from Iran, which is saying, yes, the revolution was a success because it's resistance to a Western plot and the U.S.'s influence. And you've got the bankrolling articles, the articles about the World Bank, saying that Tunisia is failing and it needs to fundamentally restructure its economy in order for the revolution to continue as a success. Now, of course, how you look at this is going to depend on what you value in the revolution and what you value in a nation. So we thought it would be a good idea to figure out exactly what we value in this situation. What we use as a yardstick for determining whether the Tunisian Revolution was successful. And of course, in order to do this, we first need to identify what we think are the most important elements of a successful nation. So Josh, let me ask you, what do you think are the most important elements of a successful nation? And what would you say are important factors to consider in judging the Tunisian Revolution?
My three main factors to determine whether a nation is successful or not is economics, power projection, and national/cultural identity. Now I want to explain each of these in turn. Economics is simple. You're not a very successful nation if you are dirt poor. No offense. Your nation's not going to last long if you don't have a penny to your name. That's why I'm saying you have to have strong economics, and this ties into power projection. Now I like to look at the United States as this, and we are strong because we are able to project our interests. If a country is not agreeing with us, or we want them to know that they should stop what they're doing, we can post sanctions or embargoes against that nation that severely limit them. Now, in regards to Tanzania, I don't think they'll ever get this level of economic or power projection might, but that is something they should strive for, to be able to project what they want on the world and be able to somewhat guard against people trying to not let them have that. That's important to me. The other thing is your national or cultural identity. Because even though you might be the richest nation in the world, it's not really a nation unless you have something to back it, something to stand for, that makes this nation you. Because otherwise, we can have a whole bunch of just blank copies of one another, and then it gets real hard to tell which is successful, which is the better one. Now, I'm not saying that national or cultural identity is used to determine who's better or not. I'm just saying that if I could choose, and there was a bunch of nations that were basically carbon copies of each other, I would choose the one that was the most different, because they showed diversity in terms of thinking and of pride. That shows that they are proud of what they're doing. They want their nation to succeed. That's an important thing. It's the want and desire for their nation to succeed. Because if you don't want to be the most successful nation, you're not going to be the most successful nation. It's just you have to want it. And that's what it ties in all this together. You have to have a strong economics to be able to project your interests, and those interests are determined from your national culture identity, which is determined by the people's desires. They all connect with each other, that all fundamentally show what the nation wants. If it doesn't show what it wants, then it's not really going to, I think, succeed as a nation.
I think you bring up some very interesting points. And I like that you bring up national and cultural identity, because you've definitely seen states in the past that have fallen apart because they lack a united identity. You see that in a lot of African nations, where European colonialism has drawn the borders in ways that force a lot of different groups into one state, whereas they might not necessarily get along. And you've definitely seen that cause problems. Before I move on to some of my own views, I want to ask, when you talk about power projection, you mainly were speaking of economic power projection, like the U.S. can use, like sanctions and embargoes. Do you feel military power projection plays a role in that? The ability to have a strong military? And if so, do you think the stability of Tunisia would play into that at all?
A military projection of strength is good, I would think, but it's not necessarily a term of successful. Here's my example for this. It's Switzerland. It's a perfectly successful because they are neutral towards all. They make no moves against either one of them, and they let anybody do their business in there. As long as they can be successful at it, they will let you do with what you want within reason. Now that to me shows that you don't really need a military might to be successful, but it does help. Switzerland is like this already because of its strong economics, its strong power, cultural identity, and strong tradition of being neutral. Now, if Tunisia tried to be like this, I don't think it would work, because they have just come out of a revolution. The government is unstable. Control of the nation's finances and security and privacy is not well defined. So many places would not feel comfortable doing what they do with Switzerland and Tanzania. So that's what I'm saying, that military presence is helpful for nations who are emerging or transitioning from third world to second world to first world. For example, as if you have an island. It's all peaceful and happy, but they want another island. Now they can negotiate, but they're not going to get it if the other nation doesn't want to give them it. That's when you send in their army to get it. You see what I'm saying? That you can't really, for a young nation, they have to rely on a military might to be successful, or at least stand on their feet long enough to be successful in the other areas that I consider to be more successful, more important in successfulness. I'm pretty sure that explanation was kind of screwed up.
No, it's okay.
Convoluted at the very least. I thought it was convoluted, but at the very least, military might is not necessary, but it is recommended for small countries that don't have other options to protect their interests.
So then, allow me to ask, based on the criteria you've laid out, based on what you say you value in a nation, was the Tunisian Revolution a success, or a failure, or something else altogether?
The Tunisian Revolution, I think, is a work in progress. Like I've said earlier, they have just come out of a revolution. Even though it's been 5 years from it, they still need a military presence to help project their interest. They're not like the United States, where we can just imply or suggest to a nation what they should do to get our aid or to stop something from happening. They have to use force to get. Now that may lead to some people saying, well, that's not good, what if they decide to invade? And then that's when I say this is also a double-edged sword, because while they may have a strong armed military presence, the country they're trying to invade also does. So it's also a deterrent to stop other countries from projecting their interests too much into a country.
Fair enough. So, based on what you've said here and elsewhere in the podcast, you're calling the Tunisian Revolution a work in progress. You're saying it needs to be able to, right now, as it continues working through the aftermath of the revolution, have a strong enough military presence and a strong enough cultural identity to maintain itself and work towards economic restoration.
Yes. This is what it all comes down to: the people. If the people don't want to be a successful nation, they won't be a successful nation. They have to want it. Is what I am saying. They have to desire to be a prosperous nation. They have to sometimes fight for it, like what we did against Britain back in our revolution. Because of the imposed taxes and the representation without taxation, we fought to be our own nation, to be successful. That's what I'm saying. That you need, for a young country that just came out of a revolution, a strong military presence to help them is almost certainly needed. Now that I've said what I consider to be the standards of being a successful nation, what are yours, William?
Okay, so mine are very different, but if you've listened to the rest of this podcast, you'll find that they're pretty much in line with what I've already said. I think the three most important elements of a nation, of a state, are self-determination, the preservation of personal liberties, and an integration into the international order. And I'll elaborate on all of those in a moment. I want to say as a disclaimer, I do think having a strong economic base, being able to defend yourself, all of those, I think those are important. But these three things I've listed, self-determination, preservation of personal liberties, and integration into the international order, I think those are really the defining criteria of what I would consider a successful nation. So self-determination. As I've said, I am definitely a Wilsonian, perhaps a bit idealist, but with self-determination, I just think people in a nation should have a right to express their desires as a nation and to be able to defend those interests. They should have a stake in their interests, whether those are economic interests, geopolitical interests, whatever those might be. They should have that right to determine the direction of their country and carry it out. Preservation of personal liberties, I think this is probably the most self-explanatory one here. The people of a nation should have the right to freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly. A lot of the same freedoms you see touted in the developed world. It's a very Western idea, but I think it's something that can be applied in any culture. It's just something that you need to have. You need to have an open public sphere. People need to be able to express themselves and be protected. You have to have due process. All of these kinds of things. And finally, by integration into the international order. That's probably the hardest one to define, but what I mean by that is the Tunisian people coming out of this revolution need to be welcomed by the rest of the international order. Especially states like the US and organizations like the UN and the European Union really need to go out of their way to help Tunisia find its path, to get on its feet. It's a very careful balancing act, because these groups and nations can't use Tunisia's moment of weakness, moment of recovery, to steer it towards its goals. That would conflict with that self-determination I was speaking about. But this is where it gets a bit idealist. You might need very selfless individuals leading those nations and organizations to come out and really be willing to help the Tunisian people get on their feet and find that path to self-determination.
My question is to you, though, do you think that those peoples, or you mentioned, would they be considered that be worth it to put all this effort into after this revolution to bring them into the fold, so to speak, with the first world? Do you think it would be worth it for them?
Probably not. That's the unfortunate thing. You've got so many different geopolitical interests at play here. You've got these questions of, would these other nations really be willing to bring Tunisia into the international order at the detriment of their own interests? And I would love for the answer to be yes, but more than likely the answer is going to be no. And I don't think that's so discouraging, though, because I do think what you've seen with the Tunisian Revolution is the fulfillment of the first two criteria. Self-determination and personal liberties. You can go back to Chomiak's article where she references just how much artistic expression has been focused on reconciling the country's future with the country's past. The Tunisian people now feel like they have a stake in their country's future. They're no longer under Ben Ali, a paternalistic leader who guides Tunisia to their whims. The Tunisian people now can say where their country's going to go in the future. Of course, that's not complete yet, because there are still other interests inside and outside of Tunisia that are looking to guide the country to meet their interests. And that's where that self-determination isn't complete yet. But between the opening of the social and political spheres and the fact that Tunisians now just have any kind of say, even if it's not much, any kind of say in their country's future, I would really call the Tunisian Revolution in that sense a success. And I'd like to see other nations of the world step up to help foster it along and give Tunisians full self-determination in regards to their country. I don't know if that will happen, but I'll say the Tunisian Revolution is a success that can go further. It's already met its goals. There's still things to be worked out, but it's a success that can go further.
I see. So, let's see. You want the Tanzanian people to your criteria for being successful is that they should be able to determine what they will do, have the freedom to do what they wish to do, and be welcome into the first world countries.
I think that's a pretty good summary of it. I think, that's exactly what needs to happen. The Tunisian people need to be respected in their ability to guide their country, to make informed decisions, and to decide the future of their country. Internally, the country needs to be welcoming of criticism and freedom of expression, and hopefully Tunisia could join the international order and could be welcomed by other nations of the world.